Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Sewell Chan, editor of the Texas Tribune. Welcome to Austin. Welcome to ISOJ, an event that I've been familiar with for about 15 years. And Rosenthal was a lot smaller when I last came here. I'm really privileged today to introduce and moderate a discussion with Jon Kelly, who is co-founder and editor-in-chief of Puck. Really innovative, nearly two-year-old
yes, nearly two. Thank you.
Publication that is doing really exciting things. And I've known Jon for quite a while. We worked together at the New York Times. Jon's career has taken him from Vanity Fair to Bloomberg, the New York Times, to private equity.
That's true.
Which we'll talk about, to The Hive, which is a Vanity Fair vertical, and now, of course, to this exciting new startup. So, Jon, I believe you have some opening remarks and a short slideshow.
Yeah, thank you, Sewell, and it's a thrill to be up here with you. We were young once at 628th Avenue, and it's fun to be able to reconnect up here. You know, for better or worse, I tend to do these things extemporaneously. So I think that we'll try and make this a bit of a semi-slideshow, and then we can just jump right into the conversation. But the subject that we're going to talk about today is one of my great fascinations, and as Sewell mentioned, it's something that I began to think about in my career in journalism, in my career in private equity, very brief career in private equity, and then career afterwards, sort of melding the two, and what we call it journalism in the era of business model evolution, imagining the end state. And I'll just put a little bit of context around that before we jump into these very brief slides. For a very long time, and certainly the era that you and I came up in, the business models were set in our industry, in what I think of as news media. At what you might think of as kind of level one news media, newspapers, radio. These were strong, independent ad and subscription-based businesses, and there wasn't a lot of room for innovation because everyone did really well, and the organizations thrived, and you didn't want to screw things up. In level two, which is the area that I came up in, magazines, affinity-based journalism, more niche-oriented, it was really more about finding consumer packaged goods and auto and similar advertising companies that wanted to reach really engaged audiences and had absolutely no metrics to understand whether they were actually having an imprint on those audiences or not. And then there was an entirely different area, level three, which you can think of as news magazines and 2020 and 60 Minutes in that world. And I'll refer more to these in a couple of slides, but my point is, it was set. When we started our career, the job was don't screw it up. You began your career in your 20s when you got out of school, and if you played by the rules, you'd get promoted every couple of years, and maybe you'd end up in management if you did well enough.
So it was about stewardship rather than innovation.
It was, absolutely. It was about stewardship. It was about managing a brand, doing good work, and on the creative side, on the journalism side, on the editorial side, it was about not even thinking about how the business worked, okay? Because we were at a steady state in the business model evolution. All right, before we flip the slide, we all know that the last 15 or 20 years have upended this in every way, and we look far afield at other industries, and we see companies, revolutionary companies like Uber or Airbnb, just to name two off the top of my head, Spotify, which will come up in a minute. We realize that actually it's the model that changed. It's what happens when you change the unit, when it's not about renting a car but renting a ride, when it's not about renting a hotel room but about using a room in your house. So in my journey in journalism and then investing in bank again, it's really been about figuring out how do you find the right business models, because if you find the right business model, then you're going to be able to actuate the change. And one of the things that I'm most proud of as the co-founder of Puck is that my journalist colleagues and partners aren't just my friends and colleagues, they're actually equity holders in the business, and they're incentivized upon success. If they drive subscribers to Puck, if they start a podcast with Puck, we compensate them out of the deals. And
so your writers get both, do they get a salary?
They get a salary.
And they get option?
We try and pay a generous salary. They are option holders in the company. They have the same vesting cliff that I do, so they're growing their wealth in Puck over a 4-year term, and then they're being incentivized to drive subscriptions. And so for us, this is our attempt at trying to figure out what the next iteration of the business model looks like. But I've given you a mouthful there, so let me move on. Okay, so I repeated myself a little bit here, but it's worth just digging in one more beat. That again, when we started, it was an era of anti-innovation, I think, and we're the same generation, so we were in those rooms, in those conversations, and it's worth recalling we work in an industry where you can't make mistakes. When you think about, I was reminded of this all the time when I was in investing. There's almost a larger consequence for making a small factual error in a news article than there is for making a $4 billion deal that goes sideways. I'm serious. And I think for a long time it held our industry back, and it held the participants in our industry back from trying to figure out new ways to change things. Because why would you change things when the system wasn't broken? Obviously, when it... things don't break all at once. They break over a long time, and as a wise investor once told me, usually when it's because you knew a couple of years ago. So I remember when I first started at the time, Sewell, when we had that meeting where they kind of indoctrinate you, the first thing that they told us was that at that point, and this is like 2011, the Huffington Post had already surpassed the New York Times in monthly active users, just by basically regurgitating the articles and putting them on their platform with pithier headlines and a better social media presence. It was the apotheosis of a trend that had been happening for time, right? A lot of exogenous factors, but a lot of own goals also.
I remember a management meeting in 2013 when Jonah Peretti was brought in as like the sage, and we were all like, okay, we've got to understand this new world.
There were false prophets in this world. There's no doubt about that. But it started early. It started in the late 90s when Google went public and crawled our algorithm, and we made the original sin in journalism, which was we didn't require them to pay for it. Facebook and to some extent Craigslist obviously took away they offered specified targeted advertising and classified advertising that newspapers had platformed for generations, and they did it much more effectively and inexpensively. The Huffington Post came along with a whole generation. You're right, BuzzFeed, Vox. There are so many others. A lot of them aren't with us any longer, and in the process, they basically redefined the core of most newsrooms, news organizations, where it used to be about all the news that was fit to print, and then you lost that incentive. It was all the news humanly possible to publish. There wasn't a big enough hamster wheel in the world. I put Chartbeat on there. That was the sort of heroine of the industry for half a decade. I remember, again, not to play Remember When, the saddest game from our time at the Times, but I remember being in rooms with Ian when he would just throw it up on the wall, and you'd say, wow, does this really make sense that 7/8 of the traffic to the New York Times is about an Apple Day event where someone is unveiling a new Apple product and no one's reading anything else? And the incentives, because we were then in a digital advertising era, was to just push the eyeballs where they were going to go. And it wasn't to offer any of the curative aspects of being an editor, which is what we grew up with, where you say, well, actually, we think this is more important, even if it's less popular. So we drank the Kool-Aid because we lost control of the business model, and then I think I put that's an attempt at the poop cruise, and then obviously 2016 and everything that came after, which I think of a lot because I came out of the magazine industry, as Sewell recognized, and if you went to a newsstand in 2001, my God, you would know exactly what was Vanity Fair or Ebony or InStyle or Entertainment Weekly. These were distinct brands and distinct audiences. If you went to any of their URLs in 2016, all you would see were Trump stories, poop cruise, Malaysian airline stories, Game of Thrones recaps. And which sort of leads me to my point that when we lost control of the business model in journalism, when we were just running from one model to the other, everyone lost their identity. And you had this moment where by mushing too much food around the plate, almost, you no longer had the meal. And I think that brands truly lost who they were. And that's led to obviously a painful period, but it's led to a flourishing and a real renewal, I think, in our space as we now realize a couple of key learnings that have come out of the last decade and maybe decade and a half of business model agony. I listed them here, but I'm sure everyone in this room already knows them. In many cases, new brands are replacing old brands. The loss of identity created an opportunity for new brands that knew who they were to enter the world with a sort of dignity and self-respect. New formats were arising. I can't stand when people refer to us as a newsletter company. We publish newsletters. We'd be crazy not to. That's how people like to read these days. You know, we publish podcasts, we publish articles on a URL. We want to meet readers where they are. Another big thing, which I know has come up here too, individual journalists were becoming as big as the institutions that they worked at. In some cases, there's been a healthy and unhealthy skepticism about institutions in our culture. But I think this is actually an only partly related topic, which really is that individual journalists are influencers. They are underpriced influencers who have extraordinary access to powerful information and platforms to disseminate it. And it was a natural byproduct of the social media era that they were going to be pillars in their own right. And we were beginning to see, through many other industries, the rise of new models that were going to make sense. Subscription, knowing your user, direct to consumer, which was the sort of trend that had taken off in every industry, from politics to transportation to clothing and fashion, has finally started to make its way to journalism. And at the end of the day, that's been a real net positive, because it means that we don't have to publish the stuff that we don't want to publish anymore. When I worked at the Hive, I felt my job was to publish 20% of the stuff we published was stuff that I loved and thought was great. 80% was the stuff that just paid the bills and created traffic. And so it's not a surprise that as we begin to see new models and new opportunities that you're seeing new brands. My brand's one of them. Substack's another great example, maybe part brand, part platform. Axios, I think Sarah's coming here tomorrow, a fantastic example, had an extraordinary exit last year. The information is sort of the OG of this. They realized 10 years before everyone else that on some level, paying for journalism was the ultimate sign of trust, and trust was just what we needed in the market. And there are many, many others, and Front Office Sports I threw up there just because it's one that I tend to love. And what's also exciting too, Sewell mentioned Jonah Peretti, who was the CEO, or is the CEO of BuzzFeed. Turns out that some of the big incumbents in this world actually learned the tricks of the trade before the new guys could beat them to the journalism. So when you see the primacy of the Washington Post and really the moat around the New York Times now, it's because they became BuzzFeed faster than BuzzFeed could become them, which is a sign that these models really are enduring. And as I've been able to think, and then I'll shut up and we can really have a conversation about it. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little long in the tooth here, but when we think about the model and the industry, I can't help but be reminded that we've been here before. What we're seeing now in online journalism is a simulacrum of what we saw in the record industry. And it's a 20-odd year journey. You and I were either in college or in short pants when Napster was founded and changed everything. I remember all of a sudden being in my dorm room with a Case Logic filled with CDs and thinking, I don't need these ever again. I can rip whatever song I want on my Sony Vaio computer and play it. And it transformed everything. There was a new unit, right? A new unit had changed from the album to the song. It was painful. Record companies went out of business. Everyone sued everyone, and people thought the world was over. But it wasn't actually. It was just an early iteration in an early inning. A couple years later, Apple introduced iTunes, which was the moment that the industry said, okay, you're going to pay for what you want, and you're going to curate it yourself, and you're going to love it, and you're going to become comfortable repurchasing this new unit. And then that created this incredible decade where platforms and actual hardware devices were built around the idea of consumer choice, that this new business model had been created, and the death of the album, or the semi-death of the album, it wasn't the end of the world. It was just an opportunity for new artistic expression. New platforms, I think Spotify and YouTube, reached their primacy as a whole new audience was able to connect with artists they would have never found before. There were new discovery mechanisms. And if you ask most people who didn't know the old world, who didn't have CDs or cassettes or 8-tracks or whatever, they'd say, this is great. We actually kind of like this. And you see towards the end of this period, Spotify goes public. You look at I took a snapshot of the global record industry now, and it's the same size it was in 1999, more or less, give or take. We've reached the end state in the music industry. My hunch is that in our industry, we're around where they were in 2005.
So that opens up just so many great questions. End state could mean a couple things. Is there a steady state possible when there's the only constant is disruption? Won't AI make it harder to get to stability? Will it be as disruptive as the web and mobile were?
I think that I heard a provocative commentary the other day from a very smart investor friend who said that in some cases, economically, Darwin got it wrong, right? That it's not a steady, gradual, quiet, unseen ascent from one model to the other. There's a sort of punctuated equilibrium where there's a change, a steady state, and change, a steady state. I think that the challenge is it's easy to mistake that in between steady state as an end state, and if you look back on that Spotify, on that music industry chart, you realize there were a lot of moments where we thought, oh, okay, maybe we're here, but there was still more evolution to go. But it goes in fits and starts. So, I don't think there's. I guess it's a cosmic philosophical question to know what the end state is. But I think that industries do change in trajectories of often of 20 to 25 years. And we've undergone a period of extraordinary disruption that's gotten us to here. And I think that when you look out to the future to what it looks like, particularly in my part of media, which is sort of affinity-based, things that used to be called magazines, you can see that we're really early in figuring out what it's going to look like. But there are some glimmers of what the business models are going to look like, what the brands are going to look like, and what the creative opportunities are going to look like. And it's okay that we don't know the end. I don't think we're rushing for it.
So Jon, you're a very accomplished writer and editor. You chose to go into private equity. Why, and more importantly, what did you learn from it? And how did that change your view of journalism and media?
It was total brain surgery to me, in the best possible way. As you mentioned, I had started a small business called The Hive at Condé Nast that had some pretty quick success, but it had success in the way a lot of media brands have success. There was buzz around it, but I knew that over the long term, because it was largely ad-based with a very porous subscription component, and we were all big company employees who had compensation packages that were pretty standard. I could see the end of this before anybody else could. It was going to be longer and slower, but because I created it, really painful for me, and I realized, okay, it's not that my colleagues and I aren't doing good work. It's just that there are so many external factors that we can't control here. What if you publish the best Gabe Sherman story of his life the same day as another country is invaded? What if the biggest publishers in the world change their algorithm and you can no longer disintermediate through their platforms? There were too many externalities. Without a core digital subscription business, I felt there were too many risks to take. And also, I knew what I didn't know. I felt if I were going to do this again and try and figure out some of the bigger questions in our industry, I needed to have the aptitude of a real media operator. So I sought an opportunity to go work at a large company called TPG, which is a private equity company, now public company, and I went in there with open arms saying, please help me, tell me what I don't know. And I was very uncomfortable early on because I was the only person like me in every room. I mean, there was nobody came from my kind of background. These were deal people. And being uncomfortable in that environment was fabulous because it forced me to second guess myself in a lot of ways. I was actually surprised to find out that there were some things that in some instincts I came in with that I left even more convinced of. But oh my God, there was a lot that I learned, and I wouldn't be here without it.
So Puck, among other things, has become indispensable to a lot of people, especially in the spheres that you really cover excellently. That includes, of course, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Wall Street, Washington, and the media itself.
Sure.
How did you select these areas? And do you see yourself deepening in these kind of verticals, or do you also see eventually kind of broadening and doing kind of other spheres of economic and social life?
Well, thank you for the compliment. I take it deeply to heart. Our initial premise was that as you scale those industries to the top, it's really one world. And then actually an extraordinary amount of power in our culture is operated by an extraordinarily small number of people. And that actually they're undercovered. I think that their motivations, their incentives, their anxieties, there's an inside conversation that takes place that most news organizations aren't incentivized to cover because maybe only a small number of people really care about it. And so, and I actually felt like when I was in private equity that.
But a small number of people with very focused interests.
Yes, but a small group of people with focused interests, and I think also who are likely to be curious about other areas that that are covered in a way that give them some sort of edge. And now I think that we've certainly taken some fair criticism that can be construed as elitism. I tend to try and turn the telescope around on that and say that for a very fair price point, I think we offer anyone who can pay $100 a year a chance to really see how it really works on the inside. And what's funny about that, oddly, it's a virtuous cycle because the people we cover immediately became our initial subscribers. And we became clubby with them in a funny way. We could break down the fourth wall. And they became our focus group and our feedback loop. And it was really powerful because they were paying attention to the work Puck did in a way that they wouldn't pay attention to a large publisher where it's hard to have that touch point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let's stay on the word elitism for a moment.
Sure.
The Puck says that among other things, you kind of connect elite journalists to their audiences.
Sure.
How does that make you different from Substack?
A couple things. I think that I think Substack's a fantastic platform and a fantastic tool. But I think, and I think it's the answer for some people. But I also think that in our view, elite journalists are influencers, right? I'm very vocal about that. That they have remarkable information gathering capacities. They have incredible networks, and they usually, as a result of those two things, have large social footprints to disseminate information. So they're really valuable. I say all the time about our guys. If Dylan Byers, who's our ace media reporter, could be a journalist, or he could be an M&A banker at Goldman Sachs. He's in the same information flow as those guys. And in some cases, we have journalists who've actually been on the other side and practiced the trade that they now cover. What's different is we also think that journalism is a team sport too. I think that you don't need teams as large as we once believed you did, because we're not playing a scale game here. I think that it's more atomic now than it used to be. But bundling, and in fact, actually Substack is now beginning to bundle writers together. I think they've probably seen how that's been successful for us and other companies. We have a ton of data and a ton of conviction that somebody who may come for Matt Bellamy, our incredible Hollywood writer, will then be interested in Dylan and then be interested in someone else. And we felt we were doing something different, and we were stronger together, and that was why we picked this path.
Well, how do you balance the individual and the collective? Because in a way, you take a certain kind of individual
Sure.
who doesn't want their own Substack, but does want to be part of this kind of very accomplished, interesting club, and is willing to work at a team, and obviously have economic incentives to do so. But are you worried that some of them will become too big and then become bigger than the brand itself?
Sure. You'd be a good investor, Sewell. Our feeling is that
No one's ever told me that.
well, it's a question that I've heard before, and I think there are a couple things here. Being stronger together, I think, actually aligns economic motives and allows everyone to do better. In all of the sort of obvious ways. You support somebody else's work, you create more value. A membership to Puck is much more valuable by adding another valuable journalist, and there's support there. I think that Substack is a perfect place for a certain kind of talent. But I think that actually for people, and really for a lot of my teammates are in our generation where they saw the best of the old world and they see the best of the new world, and they wanted something that was in between. They wanted to have real intense editing and support and great design and a marketing team and copy editors and payroll and
which is not Substack, frankly.
Those are usually do-it-yourself operations, but they also wanted the opportunity to not have to speak in an institutional voice, to be able to have to be able to be themselves in many cases. So, we felt that, as we talked about this a couple slides ago, that as brands lost their identities, there was really a barbell in the kind of journalism that I was doing. On the one hand, places like the Times or the Washington Post or CNN, who had figured it out, right? They'd figured it out and they were safe and stable again. And then on the other side of this barbell were...
Though neither CNN nor Washington Post is fully out of the woods yet.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think certainly not when it comes to intrigue and personnel murmuring, as Puck readers know well. But CNN is still profitable. I think it makes $700 million a year in profit, and the Washington Post is materially better off than when it was when the family sold it to Bezos. But in the middle, there was just the options that many journalists felt were they weren't there the way they used to be. Traditional magazines had become web properties that were in many cases losing their identity, and we saw that as an opportunity to come in and say, let's give you the best of what a magazine used to offer, and a ton of creative freedom and a ton of support.
So what are the implications of Puck's experience for mass media? I'm not saying you're not mass media, but you're not niche. I mean, it's not like a magazine for stamp collectors, but you go deep in these kind of very powerful and important areas of our society where a lot of power is wielded. And I actually think something you say is really interesting, that in a way you're democratizing the kind of insider knowledge that a corporate executive would be able to get from business intelligence, or that someone in Hollywood would get from the trade press there. But what does it mean, like, for journalists who aren't elite, to be honest? I don't mean that in a normative way, but I mean, like, if you're covering state government like we are, or if you're your community, we're doing community news or stuff that's harder to scale and kind of harder to kind of monetize. Civic news, for example. Like are there implications for that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because two things immediately come to mind. First is there are going to be a lot of winners in this new era that we're in now, in this kind of post Apple Music moment, where people realize value, have acclimated themselves with the extraordinary value in journalism. I think everything that you mentioned, and this actually dovetails with the point that was made in the previous panel, there's so much more opportunity in these kinds of journalism that you refer to, and some are niche, some are civic-minded, many are local and incredibly important, because there's a model to support them now. For a long time, that kind of journalism existed because of a local advertising model, right?
Local advertising monopoly, frankly.
Exactly.
Which is gone.
Right, which is gone, and was controlled by a bunch of families, and it was never as healthy a business as it seemed from the outside, but totally. And then those companies moved their spends to Facebook, and et cetera, et cetera. I believe firmly that the subscription / community / contribution models are absolutely going to be the answers to that kind of journalism. Right now, and I can tell you from having been in a number of these rooms, there is extraordinary, and this is what was brought up specifically in the previous panel, there is extraordinary capital ready to be put to work to figure out how to do this. I think that for a number of reasons, investor hasn't been fully matched yet with opportunity. I think part of that is because there's a language divide between how these two groups talk, particularly on the local and civic level. But there is a absolute belief at the capital threshold that these systems that the pendulum swings back, these systems that worked will work again. They're just going to work with new business models, and some risk is going to be required to figure that out. But I think that what you're talking about, these are things that people desperately care about. In some cases, you mentioned, having been in Austin for a couple of days, I think a lot about. I've been thinking about this because we're in a state government. I mean, people need information about what goes on inside those walls to do their job. Like, that's information worth paying for. That's incredibly valuable, and there's an incredible value if there are journalists who are wired in that world to be able to provide that information frankly in a format that's different than what we used to expect from the sort of business intelligence you mentioned before. Maybe it makes sense, maybe newsletters make sense for that, maybe podcasting. We have a whole feature at Puck where we do private conference calls. You can pay for a tier of membership where you can get on the phone with our journalists and do one-on-one calls, because that's maybe the way that you prefer to have your information conveyed. I think all these things are there. I think the technology has caught up to it. We just have to really support that connection between capital and entrepreneur.
So I invite folks to come up to either microphone to ask questions, and of course our online participants are welcome to submit questions as well. Jon, one more question from me. When we were talking in preparation for this panel, I mentioned companies like Semaphore and Axios that also had, investment seed money.
Sure.
And you talked about them really more as kind of enriching the space, not as direct competitors.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on how you see things that way?
Oh, happily, and I couldn't say that more forthrightly. We've learned a lot of lessons from what I think about as Web 2.0, the kind of BuzzFeed, Vox era, and which was a really contested, competitive era of digital media and online journalism. One of the things I think I learned the most was this is not a winner-takes-all market. We are in a winner-takes-some market. There are going to be a lot of winners in this new era that we're in. So when we see new entrants, we realize that it's a net good for all of us. First of all, it means that somebody else is giving it a shot and they have the guts to do it, which is important because we do come from a non-entrepreneurial industry for all the reasons we outlined before, where risk is not always rewarded, and so
so different new market entrants actually signal that this is a field worthy of investment in and innovation.
Absolutely, great minds and capital being put to work. I think there are financial benefits that come from that too, but also we learn from each other. I have direct dialogues with everyone who's in a similar position that I'm in at all those companies, because we want to share the information because we realize that actually it's going to benefit all of us. We all do things that are a little bit differently. There are overlaps. I think particularly in what I sort of I realize pedagogically referred to as tier 2 media, but affinity media, that when we were kids, our parents had 7 or 8 magazines on the table. You could,
Architecture,
exactly,
gardening.
right, Road and Track, Sports Illustrated, whatever. It's not winner takes all. We're all here to help each other, and I think that attitude actually, which exists in a lot of other industries, it dawned late on journalism because it is often a sharp-elbowed craft.
Yeah, and risk averse. Yep.
Hi.
Maybe Troy, we can close.
There you go.
Okay. Hi. So I wanted to ask you about PUC's duty of care. So how do you ensure the well-being and the mental health of the journalists and the contributors that work for you?
Sure, good question. We have unlimited paid time off. We view our company as a partnership. That was really important to me from the get-go. I actually, one of the things I learned from my brief foray in the business world was that partnership, it's not just a talking point, it really means something. When you can't actually make a business decision without bringing in a consensus of people who also support it, like, it helps the company and it helps make people feel really, really bought in. So that's sort of an indirect answer. But we're building a startup, so people do work hard. They work long hours.
So do you have some traditional employees?
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah, they're all. We have 28 employees starting on Monday.
But the principals, incling your best-known writers, have equity. Yeah.
Everyone has equity. Everyone is an equity holder.
All the 28 do. Okay.
Yeah, everyone. All 28 on Monday. And be generous with benefits. It matters. Be generous with paid time off. Be generous with mental health leave. We were a company that started in the pandemic. My partners and I raised capital when in the most uncertain days. I got my first term sheet the day that Tom Hanks announced he had COVID. Like, we were very sympathetic to that, and we muddled through it, doing Zooms in our kids' bedrooms, and we realized that journalism is not a job. It's not a 9-to-5 job. You guys all know that. You're exchanging texts with your editors and your sources at all hours, running out of kids' birthday parties to be responsive or tweet something. If that's the mandate, then you got to be extremely generous, and I think that means different things to different people. But you know it when you see it. You got to be really, really good to people.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, Christopher Guess. In your history of sort of the modern era of the destruction of journalism, you seem to put the onus pretty squarely on the tech companies, especially Google, Facebook, Craigslist, et cetera. I'm wondering, especially given your employment history, your thoughts on the consolidation by private equity, and some would say, the destruction of a lot of local news to just push the additional monetization of local and small news well beyond what they could ever actually afford in themselves?
Good question. There are a lot of factors in what's happened for the last 20 years. I think a lot of them are macroeconomic. Some are avoidable, some are not. If Facebook or Google had not come along, I think similar companies would have were able to find opportunities to make themselves really attractive to digital advertisers. I think that your point about the local papers in the hedge fund industry is certainly a point well taken. There's a really well-documented history of hedge funds. I think Alden Capital is probably the one that comes to people's mind the most, that really saw in this business a tear-down investment thesis where they were able to is a terrible investing term, but yeah, they were extract value by basically taking assets, figuring out what the real estate values were, figuring out what the human values were, finding ways to put them together. And so I don't mean to minimize any of that. That's all real. And not to turn it around, but just to give you a totally on the level answer. I get it, and I've worked at a lot of big companies where I was in rooms with executives that I didn't know what their ulterior motives were either. Our partnership comes from the fact that we felt, particularly on the creative side of the business, if we didn't do this, they weren't going to do it for us. So we had to come together at a certain point in our career and say, hey, we want to build a company, we want to do it together, we want to share on the upside together, we want to be able to ensure, to your point, Sewell, about the bundle of talent, to make sure that when Julia Yaffe does well, it helps Teddy Schleifer do well, and vice versa.
It's kind of journalists taking control of their destiny.
We totally viewed it that way. We did not want to have to relive that movie, because you make an excellent point, and I didn't mean to minimize it anyway.
Thank you. One question from an online participant. Do you think there's newsletter fatigue? There are so many.
Sure. Oh, of course there is. I bristle at that word just because a newsletter, there are many different sort of genres of newsletter. There's newsletter fatigue the way that there is Floribama Shore show fatigue, or Real Housewives fatigue, or true crime fatigue, or back in the day, magazine spin-off fatigue. People, and the way that, by the way, up until very recently, there was podcast fatigue. When a format works, media executives tend to jump at it. There's very little barrier to entry in newsletter. But that said, the people who do it really, really well, and I think there's a panel about this tomorrow, the people who do it really well find that it is so rewarding. And one detail I should have mentioned before was we send via email any article that you want to sign up for if you're a Puck subscriber. I know from the point of view of our journalists, it's the most fulfilling part of their job, because they get direct and immediate feedback from their readers. I send an email newsletter myself, or what we call them private emails, every Saturday. I actually just wrote it in my hotel room before. It goes out to a couple 100,000 people. I get hundreds of responses every Saturday. Some of whom say, please unsubscribe me, but many of whom have really constructive thoughts about what we're trying to build here.
It's a direct relationship with
it totally is, and it's amazing.
Okay, a couple more questions. Next, please.
Hi, I'm Jay Rosen from NYU.
Oh, hey.
And
I know you're from Twitter.
thanks. And I've been a subscriber to Puck
Jay, speak into the mic, please.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
I've been a subscriber to Puck since the beginning.
Thank you.
I'm very interested in it as a product. And the question that I wanted to ask you is about the news opinion distinction.
Sure.
Because when I'm reading one of your writers, like Will, your financial writer.
Yeah, Cohen.
He's sort of taking me on a trip in which he's discovered a lot of things, and he's using his knowledge from his background, and he's explaining things to me. And then he's also giving his view on it, like, this is total bullshit, for example, which would not be unusual at all as a sentence in his writing. Sure. So from my point of view as an academic looking at the kind of journalism that is being published, there's actually no distinction whatsoever between news and opinion in this formula. So my question is, was this part of the concept from the beginning? Or is this just an artifact of letting the writers do their thing?
Well, thanks so much. That's a great question. And actually, if you want to talk more, I'm around. I'd love to get your views on it. Our very intentional feeling was certainly no one just writes. I mean, the editing at Puck is as significant as any place I've worked, just because the writers demand it, and we want to offer it. It makes the product feel cohesive. But actually, I often felt that it was a weakness of other places I'd worked, that you had to go somewhere for the hard news and somewhere for the opinion. And I think that actually what we believe that journalists are domain experts, and that their journalism is one of the arrows in their quiver, so to speak. So we actively encourage, and from conception, actively encourage our journalists to write what they report, write what they know, and write what they think. And not just because I think it's the best form of communication, I think it's the most accurate, and I think it's often the most connective.
But this is totally new, right? Because the Vanity Fair or the New Yorker, don't distinguish traditionally between news and opinion. And it's kind of more the magazine world. I mean, it's more
Sure.
the newspaper world that has tried to establish those boundaries.
I feel incredibly comfortable doing this. We certainly, we would never publish anything that we intended to be just unnecessarily provocative. But I think that I guess I look at it differently, and I'm totally open to those who disagree with me on this. But I believe that why would you ever deprive the reasoning and intellectual and theorizing skills of fantastic reporters to make their points? I think it would be as unwise as depriving them of the skills of their literacy and rhetoric.
Would I be correct in saying, you don't publish polemic, but you do publish perspective?
Oh, totally. No, totally.
Analysis.
Yes.
But a kind of grounded authority.
And to Jay's point, which was totally a great valid point, Bill Cohan, the writer he mentions, was an M&A banker for 20 years on Wall Street. At Lazard and J.P. Morgan pre the Chase merger. So we actually view it as he is quite literally a domain expert who can cover the art of M&A deal making, both as a journalist and as someone who's actually been in the room themselves. I actually think that's one of my values as an editor now too.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Rodney Gibbs with AJC. I'm curious about you offer the off-the-record conversations as a membership perk. How do you balance offering that without at least having the optics of you're selling access? I think about some of the hot water Washington Post got in with its dinners several years ago, or Atlantic. I think they had these salon events or dinners.
Great question. We do as a feature of our Inner Circle membership, which is our highest priced membership point. We offer that connection point with the journalists. A couple things immediately come to mind on this. One, I think that you're referring to the Marcus Broccoli era, Lowry Weymouth era salons that I think they charge $75,000 for. The industry's actually changed a lot since that happened. I think that in many media companies now view that kind of ideation session, whatever you want to call it, as a sort of marketable sales tool. And I think that it's a totally valid one, actually, as long as no one's doing anything inappropriate, and there usually are pretty strict ethical guidelines around it. Our Inner Circle calls, to me, are a totally kosher next level of relationship with the writers, without sounding hackneyed. I swear to God.
Are they off the record?
They're off the record. Without sounding hackneyed, we believe in farm-to-table journalism. I don't think it's enough to be able to just, for many people, to go to a restaurant and order the chicken. You want to know if it's Lancaster County chicken from some Amish farm, and you want the chef to come to the table and introduce himself also. I believe that's true with journalism as well, that you don't just want to, you could just want to read a Dylan Byers story, but to have the chance to actually connect with Dylan and talk to him in a setting that's comfortable for both of you, where there's no exchange that's improper, I think that's breaking down the fourth wall, and we feel comfortable with it.
Last question, please.
Hi, Vivian Wu. I'm running a new startup, media. So So all of your conversation is very relevant. Actually, two questions for both of you. First, it's like Jon, you are creating this. Is this community or just an elite club? Because I'm struggling with these two concepts.
Sure.
So community is about you encourage people to participate as part of the community. But you mentioned the elite club. But the thing is, all your contributors, writers, they made their brands, they made their names due to their relationship or their achievement with the institutions. But now you're saying we're not building the institutions. So it might be an elite club, but their reputation is built on their relation with the institutions. So what's your are you thinking about this, or you have any plan to extend this pool of creators? Second question is, do you want to talk about your financial situation? How long is your runway? Are you making money? Or what's your capital secret plan?
Sure.
And another question for Sewell. Actually, I'm trying to create this community. I'm trying to aggregate a bunch of senior reporters, veteran journalists, specifically from China, Chinese language community, which is struggling. None of these conferences has any mention of this. But do you have any tips or advice for me to specifically help with a group of community that is suffering specific issues, but they need to extend their knowledge to the global audience?
Thank you so much.
you.
I'll find you afterward to discuss the last question.
Yeah,
But John,
I'll go
why-
fast. I know we're on the clock here, so let me offer 3 very practical answers to that. There is a Venn diagram that overlaps significantly between community and club. I think it depends a lot on the back and forth between the members of the community and how much access they have, message boards, connectivity, what their expectations are. I think also there's a price plays a part in that too. People, when the price accelerates, I think your expectations accelerate as a community member. So those are important things to think about. We're a startup 2 years in, so we're not attempting to be profitable. This is all public information. You can find with the SEC. We raised $7 million. We have two fantastic investors, TPG, where I used to work, and Standard Investments, and we're thrilled with them and where we are. And I think that taking money from outside capital is something that scares people, and it shouldn't. It's important. And then just one quick last thing. I think your idea sounds great. If I could offer any advice from having just been on this rodeo, start really small. Really, 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 really small, and get it right. You don't want to spend money, realize you made mistakes, and have to make drastic changes.
John, one final
Okay,
question,
sorry.
because we're at a university, and this is from a student. If you're about to obtain this is from a student about to obtain a college degree in journalism, should they be focusing in their education on incorporating traditional media skills, or trying to implement their own businesses and create their own businesses, considering the current digital context?
I will answer that quickly. I'm curious to know what you did actually when you were a 22-year-old kid. The best advice I ever got in my life, I didn't go to journalism school, I worked at the school paper, but I was told early on, find someone who you admire and be as useful to them as humanly possible, and you'll learn a trade. And I think that, sure, it sounds like it's a very smart young person who wants to ace the test and know everything about everything, all the new platforms and all the new media. Find someone great, get as close to them as possible, soak it up, and for me, that made all the difference in the world.
Jon Kelly, Puck, thank you.
Thanks, guys.